I never believed my husband died by accident. For 23 years, I balanced his books, smiled at company dinners, raised our daughter while he built an empire of imports I never questioned. He called me his anchor. I believed him because it was easier than asking what the late-night calls really meant. Then the funeral flowers wilted, the condolence casseroles emptied, and I opened the safe I'd never touched. Inside, ledgers that didn't match our life, numbers in red ink that belonged to men who don't send polite reminders. A debt large enough to bury me twice over. The kind of debt that comes with visitors who knock once, then stop asking nicely. I'm not the fragile widow they expected. Late 40s, curves that still turn heads when I walk into a room, skin that holds its glow under soft light, hair falling in dark waves I no longer bother to tame. Men still look. I still notice. But grief, or whatever this hollow thing is, has sharpened everything else. The rain didn't feel cinematic. It felt like an audit, cold, persistent, and looking for a reason to bankrupt her. Kang Ji-won sat in the driver's seat of the black sedan, the engine idling with a rhythmic metallic cough. At 48, she had learned that beauty was a weapon best kept polished. Even now, her tailored charcoal coat clung to curves that had only deepened with age, a silhouette of quiet, expensive maturity. She checked her reflection in the rear-view mirror. Dark hair swept back, red lips a sharp contrast against skin that refused to sag. She looked like a woman who had spent 20 years balancing ledgers for a ghost. In the glove box sat the real inheritance, not the insurance payout, which the bank had swallowed in a week, not the house in Gangnam, which was already being appraised by men with thick necks and thick patience. It was a leather-bound book filled with names, dates, and numbers that didn't add up to a legitimate import business. 25 billion won. My husband wasn't an importer. He was a hole in the ground where money went to die. She shifted into gear. The car lurched. It was the same car he'd died in, or so the Black Lotus associates told her when they delivered the wreckage like a grim gift. They hadn't cleaned the passenger side. There were still coffee stains on the dash. The GPS led her to the edge of Incheon, where the salt air rotted the fences and the streetlights flickered with a dying pulse. So's Auto. A corrugated metal shack that looked like a place where secrets were buried under oil pans. She stepped out, heels clicking against the cracked pavement. The door groaned open. Inside, the air smelled of burnt rubber and cheap tobacco. A man stood under the skeletal frame of a raised SUV. He looked younger than her, perhaps early 30s, but his movements had a heavy, grounded composition. He didn't look up when she entered. He just kept wiping a wrench with a rag that was more grease than fabric. He was broad-shouldered, his forearms corded with the kind of lean muscle that came from labor, not a gym. His face was a mask of calm, masculine indifference. "We're closed," he said. His voice was a low, sandpaper rasp. "The sign says 24 hours for emergencies," Ji-won countered. She leaned against a work table, letting the coat fall open just enough. A calculated move. A man with hands that dirty usually has a mind that's easy to read. The mechanic finally looked at her. He didn't linger on her chest or the line of her legs. He looked at her eyes with a flat, unsettling intensity. "That car shouldn't be running," he said, nodding toward the door. "It's stubborn, like its owner. It's a death trap. The frame is bent. The axle is screaming." He tossed the wrench onto a metal tray. The clang echoed. Why are you driving a coffin, ma'am? Because I can't afford a funeral for myself yet. Ji-won walked toward him, the scent of her perfume, something floral and dangerous, cutting through the smog of the shop. I was told you handle delicate modifications, people who need to move things without being seen. Min-ho's expression didn't flicker. He reached for a cigarette, lit it, and blew a plume of smoke toward the ceiling. He's lying. He knows exactly who I am. He's looking at me like I'm a ghost he forgot to exorcise. You heard wrong, he said. I have 25 billion reasons why I'm right. Min-ho took a slow drag, his eyes tracking a drop of rain as it slid down her neck. He stepped closer, invading her space with a calm that felt like a threat. He was a head taller, smelling of smoke and cold iron. Go home, Mrs. Kang. Sit in your big house until they take the furniture. It's cleaner that way. Ji-won's hand moved before she could think. She grabbed the front of his grease-stained jumpsuit, pulling him down to her level. Her eyes were jagged glass. My daughter's tuition is due in a month. My husband is a pile of ash. I don't want clean. I want a mechanic who doesn't ask questions. Min-ho looked down at her hand, then back at her face. He didn't pull away. He didn't even blink. I don't fix cars for the Black Lotus, he whispered. Then fix it for the woman who's going to burn them down. Min-ho reached up, his fingers surprisingly cool as he detached her hand from his collar. He didn't let go immediately, his thumb brushing against her wrist where her pulse thudded like a trapped bird. Come back tomorrow, he said, his voice devoid of heat. If the brakes don't fail before then. Is that a promise or a threat? Min-ho turned back to the SUV, the light casting his shadow long and sharp across the oil-slicked floor. It's a refund. The brakes didn't fail. They just screamed, a high-pitched metal-on-metal wail that announced Ji-won's arrival like a herald of the damned. She pulled into the lot at 6 a.m. The Incheon fog was thick, tasting of salt and industrial exhaust. Min-ho was already there, sitting on a plastic crate outside the bay, drinking coffee from a paper cup. He wore the same dark jumpsuit, sleeves pushed up to reveal a faded tattoo on his inner forearm, a series of blurred coordinates. He didn't greet her. He just watched her climb out of the sedan. Today, she wore a cream silk blouse and high-waisted trousers that hugged her hips, an outfit that screamed luxury in a graveyard of rusted steel. You're late, he said. He hadn't looked at his watch. The car struggled. It's having an existential crisis. It's having a mechanical failure. Don't romanticize a bad alternator. He's younger, but he talks like he's already buried 3 lifetimes. Ji-won walked past him into the shop, her heels echoing. She spotted a stack of papers on his workbench, her car's registration, and a printed photo of her husband's funeral. She felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. You've been busy. Min-ho stood up, his movements fluid and economical. He followed her in, his presence closing the gap between the door and the workbench. I don't like surprises, especially ones that come in 500 million won cars. I'm here for the modifications, she said, turning to face him. I need a hidden compartment, large enough for a ledger, small enough to bypass a standard police sweep. Min-ho let out a short, dry laugh. It wasn't a sound of amusement. You think the police are your problem? Chairman Ro's men don't use flashlights. They use crowbars and pliers. They'll take the car apart, piece by piece, until they find what they're looking for. Then they'll do the same to you. I'm an accountant, Mr. So. I know how to hide things where people aren't looking. You're a widow with a target on her back, he countered. He stepped toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his irises. He smelled like peppermint and gasoline. You're playing at a game you don't even know the rules to. Go back to your spreadsheets. He wants me to leave so he doesn't have to look at the mess he helped create. I'm not leaving, she said, her voice dropping an octave. She reached out, her fingers tracing the edge of the workbench, dangerously close to his hand. Unless you're afraid to touch the car. Does it remind you of something? Min-ho's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He grabbed a heavy mallet from the rack, his grip white-knuckled. I'll do the work, he snapped, but I'm doing it wrong. Ji-won frowned. Excuse me? I'm going to rig the ignition, he said, his eyes narrowing. Every third time you start it, it'll stall. You'll have to come back here to reset the bypass. It's the only way I can make sure you're still breathing. You're sabotaging my car to keep me on a leash? I'm sabotaging your car so you don't end up in a ditch before I decide what to do with you. Ji-won stepped into his personal space, her chest nearly brushing his. She was shorter, but she used the height difference to look up at him with a gaze that was pure, unfiltered provocation. You're very protective for a man who claims not to care, Min-ho. He didn't flinch at the use of his name. He just looked down at her, his expression as flat as a tombstone. I don't like unfinished business, he said. And your husband left a lot of loose ends. He turned away, dismissing her. The dismissal felt like a physical slap. He picked up a drill and pulled the trigger, the whine of the motor drowning out any chance of a retort. Ji-won stood there for a moment, her face burning with a mix of fury and something else, a jagged spark of adrenaline. She walked toward the exit, stopping at the threshold of the fog. Fix the car, mechanic, she called out over the noise. But don't think for a second that I'm the one on a leash. She stepped out into the gray morning. Behind her, the drill stopped. The silence was heavier than the noise. The envelope was tucked under the windshield wiper, sodden with harbor mist. Ji-won didn't need to open it to know what was inside. The heavy, cream-colored cardstock was the calling card of the Black Lotus, a funeral invitation for a woman who wasn't dead yet. She entered the shop, the paper clutched in her hand like a weapon. The shop was dark, save for a single flickering fluorescent bulb over the workbench. Min-ho was under her car, only his legs visible, his boots scuffed and oil-darkened. They were at my house, she said. Her voice didn't shake, but it was thin, like wire pulled too tight. The sliding dolly creaked. Min-ho rolled out from under the chassis. He sat up, wiping his forehead with the back of a hand that was more black than skin. He looked at the envelope in her hand, his eyes tracking the embossed gold lotus. Chairman Rowe likes his manners, Min-ho said. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded bored. Did they stay for tea? They left a note. They're waiving the interest for the first month as a gesture of respect for my mourning. She tossed the envelope onto his chest. How much do you know about Rowe? Min-ho stood, the movement a slow, predatory uncoiling of muscle. He looked down at the envelope, then at Ji-won. She was wearing a deep emerald wrap dress today, the fabric clinging to her curves with a deliberate, mature elegance that felt entirely too loud for a grease pit. I know he likes Confucianism and compound fractures, Min-ho said. He walked to a sink in the corner, scrubbing his hands with orange-scented pumice. And I know He doesn't waive interest unless he's planning on taking the principal out of your skin. He's talking like a man who's watched it happen. Maybe he was the one holding the pliers. I need to make a payment, Ji-won said, stepping closer. I have 3 million won in the trunk, cash, from the jewelry I sold this morning. I need you to show me where to drop it so it actually reaches the ledger. Min-ho stopped scrubbing. He turned, water dripping from his hands, his gaze flat and dangerous. You think you're paying a utility bill? You show up at a Lotus Den with 3 million won, and they'll take the money, your car, and your dignity before the sun goes down. Then come with me. Min-ho laughed, a short, jagged sound. I'm a mechanic, Mrs. Kang, not a bodyguard. You're a man who knows where the bodies are buried, she shot back. She stepped into his space, her perfume clashing with the scent of industrial soap. You've been sabotaging my car for 2 days to keep me coming back. Why? If you wanted me gone, you'd have fixed the axle and sent me to my grave. You're watching me because you're waiting for something. Min-ho leaned in, his face inches from hers. His breath was warm, smelling of coffee and a grim masculine resolve. I'm waiting for you to realize that being pretty doesn't make you bulletproof, he whispered. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder as he grabbed a heavy leather jacket from a hook. The contact was brief, but it felt like a burn. He didn't look at her as he zipped it up, his jaw set in a hard, composed line. Get in the car, he commanded. Are we going to the drop? We're going to see a man named Dong-sik. He's a bottom feeder, but he's the one who handles the street-level debt. Min-ho paused at the door, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. And if you speak, speak in numbers. Don't try to be human. They don't recognize the currency. They drove in silence. Min-ho took the wheel, his hands steady on the steering column, his movements precise and calm. Ji-won watched his profile, the sharp line of his nose, the way his eyes never stayed on one spot for more than a second. He's younger, but he drives like a man who's spent his life escaping. The office was a basement beneath a seafood market. The air was thick with the smell of gutting fish and old blood. Dong-sik was a fleshy man with a cheap suit and eyes that darted like flies. When he saw Min-ho, he went pale, the cigarette in his hand trembling. Min-ho? You're supposed to be in a hole somewhere. I moved, Min-ho said. He didn't sit. He stood behind Ji-won like a shadow. Ji-won placed the stack of bills on the scarred wooden table. 3 million, for the Kang estate debt. Record it. Dong-sik looked from the money to Min-ho, then to Ji-won's face. A slow, greasy grin spread across his features. The widow. Beautiful. The chairman mentioned you were curvaceous. He didn't mention you had a pet dog. Min-ho's hand moved faster than Ji-won could track. He grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the desk and slammed it down onto Dong-sik's hand, pinning it to the wood. The bone didn't break, but the scream stayed trapped in the man's throat as Min-ho leaned his weight into it. Record the payment, Dong-sik, Min-ho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. And keep her name out of your mouth, or I'll see if your tongue works as well as your fingers. Ji-won watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt a sickening jolt of adrenaline, not at the violence, but at the cold, efficient way Min-ho protected her. It wasn't gallantry. It was a territorial claim. Outside, in the rain-slicked alley, she stopped him. She grabbed his arm, pulling him around. You didn't have to do that. I didn't do it for you, he snapped, shaking her off. I did it because if he thinks I'm soft, he'll start asking questions about why I'm still alive. You're a liar, Min-ho. He turned on her, his eyes jagged and dark. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat, before he settled for gripping the doorframe of the car, effectively pinning her between the vehicle and his body. The money only bought you a week, he growled. Next time, they'll want more than jewelry. I have more to sell. Good. Sell the house. Move to Jeju. Disappear. I can't. My daughter. Your daughter doesn't care if you're a martyr, Ji-won. She just wants the checks to clear. The truth hit her harder than a physical blow. She looked away, her eyes stinging. For a second, the mask slipped. The beautiful, seductive widow replaced by a woman who was simply, devastatingly alone. Min-ho saw it. His expression shifted, a momentary crack in the stone. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear before it could fall, his touch surprisingly gentle. Don't cry, he said, his voice dropping to a low, jagged rasp. It makes you look like a victim, and victims don't survive the lotus. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned and climbed into the driver's seat. Get in, he said. The brakes are starting to slip again. The shop was empty when Ji-won arrived, but the scent of him remained, metallic, sharp, and grounded. She didn't call out. Instead, she sat in the passenger seat of her own car, the door ajar, and pulled the hidden ledger from her handbag. Accounting is just the art of making the invisible visible. She traced the columns of her husband's handwriting. The numbers were a confession. He hadn't just been laundering, he'd been skimming. Small amounts diverted to a private account in a daughter's name. A desperate, clumsy attempt to buy a future with blood money. Her eyes stopped on a recurring entry from 15 years ago. Project Chrysanthemum. Beside it, a payment marked voided. You're digging in a graveyard. Min-ho stood at the garage entrance, a heavy chain in his hand. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes making him look older, more masculine in his exhaustion. He dropped the chain. It hit the concrete with a sound like a gunshot. My husband didn't just die, Ji-won said, stepping out of the car. She held the ledger up. He was executed, and this project was the reason. Min-ho walked toward her, his pace slow and deliberate. He didn't look at the book. He looked at the way her silk shirt strained against her chest as she breathed, the jagged rhythm of her panic fueling his own irritation. Everyone dies for a reason in this city, Ji-won. Usually it's greed. He was trying to get out, she snapped, stepping into his path. He was saving for Hye-jin. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a liar, Min-ho finished, stopping inches from her. He smelled of rain and cold grease. He was a liar who thought he could outrun his own shadow. You're doing the same thing. Look at you, wearing 5 million won in clothes to a chop shop, pretending you're still the wife of a businessman. I am what I have to be to survive. You're a distraction. Min-ho reached out, his hand gripping her waist, pulling her forward until her curves were pressed against the rough fabric of his jumpsuit. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a containment. She's too warm. Too much life in a room full of dead parts. You come here asking for help, but you don't even know what you're asking me to be. I'm asking you to be honest, she whispered, her hands resting on his broad shoulders. She felt the tension in him, the way his heart hammered a frantic, guilty code against her own. Who was the chrysanthemum hit meant for, Min-ho? The air in the shop turned to ice. Min-ho didn't pull away. He tightened his grip, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of her hip. It was a house cleaning, he said, his voice a jagged rasp. A man who knew too much. A man who thought he could buy his way out with a school photo. Ji-won's breath hitched. She saw the flicker of a memory in his eyes, a younger version of the man before her, standing in the dark with a weapon and a choice. It was him, she breathed. You were there. 15 years ago. I was the one who didn't pull the trigger, Min-ho growled, shoving her back toward the car. The rejection was sharp, a physical sabotage of the moment. And it's the only mistake I've ever made that I actually regret. Why? Min-ho grabbed a rag and began cleaning a part that was already spotless. His hands were shaking, just enough to notice. Because if I'd killed him then, you wouldn't be here now. You'd be a widow with a clean conscience, instead of a target with a debt you can't pay. I don't want a clean conscience, Ji-won said, her voice turning cold, seductive in its malice. She walked toward the exit, pausing to look back at his broad, hunched back. I want my money back. And I want the name of the man who actually finished the job. Min-ho didn't look up. He just threw the rag into the corner. Go home, Ji-won. Before I remember why I was hired in the first place. The smell of ozone and cheap cologne hit Min-ho before he even flipped the breakers. He didn't reach for the light. He reached for the heavy iron pipe stashed beneath the tire rack. You always did have a nose for trouble, Min-ho. Or maybe it's just the smell of grease covering up the scent of a rat. The voice came from the shadows near the back office. Dong-sik stepped into a sliver of moonlight, flanked by two men whose silhouettes were all shoulders and no neck. Dong-sik wasn't smiling anymore. He looked like a man who had found a winning lottery ticket in a gutter. I'm closed, Dong-sik. Get out before I put you through the car press. Closed? No, I think you're just getting started. Dong-sik tossed a grainy thermal-printed photo onto the hood of Ji-won's sedan. It was a shot from 15 years ago. Min-ho, younger, thinner, standing outside a primary school with a long-range rifle case. Chairman Rowe thinks you died in that pier explosion in 11. Imagine his face when he finds out his favorite little ghost has been playing house with the widow of the man he failed to kill. Min-ho's grip on the pipe tightened. I should have burned the files. I should have burned the whole city. What do you want? A shipment is coming through the Incheon docks tomorrow. Sophisticated electronics. High yield, high risk. I need a driver who knows the back alleys, and a mechanic who can make a van look like a flower delivery truck. Dong-sik leaned in, his eyes gleaming with a sick gray morality. Do this, and the photo stays in my pocket. Refuse? And I tell the chairman that the man who stole his hit is currently sleeping with his debt. I don't sleep with her, Min-ho rasped, the lie tasting like copper. Not yet. But you're protecting her like she's carrying your pulse. Dong-sik signaled his men to move. Tomorrow, 2 a.m. Don't be late, or I'll send the chairman's boys to the widow's house for a midnight audit. The shop fell silent again, but the air felt poisoned. Ji-won arrived an hour later. She didn't knock. She found Min-ho sitting in the dark, his hands buried in his hair. He looked small for the first time, a giant collapsed under the weight of his own history. I found it, she said, her voice a hollow echo. She held a birth certificate and a bank slip. My husband didn't just skim money. He was paying off someone to keep us safe. ASM. Every month for 5 years after the hit failed. Min-ho didn't look up. She thinks I was an angel. I was just a coward who couldn't finish a job and took a pension for my failure. I'm not a hero, Ji-won. I was an extortionist with a conscience. She walked toward him, the silk of her dress rustling like a warning. She didn't offer comfort. She reached out and grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were hard, beautiful, and utterly merciless. You took his money while he lived, and now you're taking mine while he's dead. I'm trying to keep you alive, he roared, standing so quickly he knocked her back a step. Dong-sik knows. He has photos. He's pulling me back in, and if I go, I'm taking the Lotus's eyes with me. Then don't go. Kill him. Min-ho stared at her. She looked magnificent in her fury, curvy, mature, and dripping with a seduction that was purely lethal. You talk about murder like it's a line in a ledger, he whispered. I'm an accountant, Min-ho. I know when a debt can't be paid with interest. Sometimes you have to write off the entire account. She stepped closer, her hand sliding over the corded muscle of his chest, her touch a sabotage of his remaining resolve. She wasn't asking for a savior. She was recruiting an accomplice. Tell me the truth, she breathed, her lips inches from his. Did you love the hunt, or did you just love the power of letting him live? Min-ho didn't answer with words. He grabbed her waist, his fingers bruising the silk, and shoved her against the cold metal of the car. The impact was sharp, a physical punctuation mark. I hated him, Min-ho hissed, his face a mask of composed masculine rage. But I hate myself more for looking at you and wishing I'd pulled that trigger 15 years ago. He let go of her as if she were made of fire. He walked to the tool wall and grabbed his heavy wrench. I'm going to the docks. Stay in the house. Lock the doors. Is that an order? Min-ho paused at the bay door, the rain beginning to lash against the pavement. It's a eulogy, he said, for whoever comes to your door tonight. He disappeared into the storm. Ji-won stood alone in the shop, her hand resting on the hood of the car he'd sabotaged. She looked at the engine, the parts he'd purposely loosened to keep her coming back. He thinks he's the only one who knows how to break things. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, heavy object she'd taken from her husband's safe. A Beretta. Some debts required a different kind of audit. The docks were a cathedral of rusted shipping containers and rhythmic artificial shadows. Ji-won didn't wait for him to come back. She tracked the coordinates from Min-ho's forgotten work log, her pulse a steady, metronomic beat in her ears. She found him behind a stack of crates, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Dong-sik was there, flanked by 3 others. They weren't just moving electronics, they were moving people, or at least the paper trail that led back to the Black Lotus's black site operations. Min-ho stood in the center, his hands raised, his expression a mask of hollow composure. He wasn't fighting. He was negotiating. The ledger is burned, Dong-sik, Min-ho said, his voice carrying over the sound of the tide. There's nothing left to blackmail me with. The past is dead. The past doesn't die, Min-ho. It just collects interest. Dong-sik gestured, and one of his men pulled a familiar object from a holster. It was the same caliber her husband had carried. Ji-won didn't shout. She didn't hesitate. She stepped out from the shadow of a crane, the weight of the Beretta in her grip cold and grounding. "He's right," she called out, her voice clear, sharp. "The past is dead, but it still owes me a payment." The men turned. Min-ho's eyes widened, a rare, jagged crack in his calm. "Ji-won, get out." "I told you, mechanic. I'm not a pet." She looked at Min-ho, then at the men closing the distance. "I know who you are. I know you were the one hired to kill him. I know you're the reason I spent 15 years living a lie, thinking my husband was a saint while he was just a ghost waiting to be buried." Dong-sik laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Oh, the widow knows? Does she know he didn't spare your husband out of pity? He just found someone who paid better to keep the secret buried." Min-ho's face went rigid, the betrayal in Ji-won's eyes striking him harder than any blow. "That's a lie," he rasped, though he didn't look at her. "Is it?" Ji-won stepped closer, the gun aimed steadily at Dong-sik, but her gaze locked on Min-ho. She was beautiful in the harsh dockside light, her maturity a fortress of cold, calculated fury. "You were never the hero, were you? You were just the highest bidder." She turned the gun not on Dong-sik, but on Min-ho. "I never asked for your protection," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the wind. "I asked for the truth. You gave me a comfortable lie for a few extra years of silence." She pulled the trigger. The shot didn't hit him. It shattered the crates behind him, the force of the sound echoing off the metal containers like a scream. Min-ho didn't flinch. He walked toward her, right into the path of the barrel, his eyes dark, drowning, filled with a jagged gray morality that defied redemption. "Do it," he said, his voice a low, broken rasp. "If that's what it takes to balance your books, do it." Ji-won looked at him, the grease on his hands, the guilt in his posture, the absolute cold surrender in his eyes. She didn't pull the trigger again. She brought her hand up and struck him across the face, a hard, skin-stinging slap that snapped his head to the side. "I don't forgive you," she spat, her voice trembling with the effort of holding herself together. "I just don't want you to die before I'm finished with you." She turned and walked into the darkness of the terminal, leaving him standing in the rain, the taste of her palm still burning on his cheek. Min-ho reached up, his fingers brushing the mark she'd left, his expression a monument to the ruin he'd become. He watched her go, a man who had finally realized that some debts were never meant to be paid off. They were only meant to be lived with. The shop was a tomb of silence for 3 days. Min-ho stayed under the hood of a rusted sedan, his hands moving with a frantic, rhythmic precision that looked like penance. He didn't look at the door. He didn't check the perimeter. He just kept grinding metal until the spark showers felt like an anesthetic. Then, the storefront glass shattered. It wasn't a tactical breach. It was a sledgehammer through the tempered pane. 3 men in gray suits stepped over the shards, their movements stiff, rehearsed. They weren't collectors. They were cleanup crew. "Chairman Rowe sends his regards," the leader said, his voice flat. "He's tired of the ledger, Min-ho. He wants the primary account closed." Min-ho didn't reach for the pipe this time. He reached for the heavy steel plate he'd welded onto his workbench, a shield he'd built for a life he never wanted to lead. He slammed it upright just as a silenced pistol spat lead into the metal. I am a mechanic. I build things that run. I am not a weapon. He lunged, catching the lead man's wrist and snapping it with a sickening wet crunch. He fought like a man who had already accepted his own expiration date, his movements brutal and efficient. No style, no grace, just the raw, jagged violence of a man who'd spent 15 years practicing how to survive. He took a knife to the shoulder. He didn't blink. He just drove his own fist into the man's throat and watched him fold. Then the door groaned open again. Ji-won didn't walk in with a gun this time. She walked in with a flare of red lipstick and a calm that was more terrifying than the violence. She saw the blood on the floor, the broken glass, and the way Min-ho was gasping for air against the workbench, his shoulder a ruin of torn fabric and dark, wet crimson. She didn't run to him. She walked, her heels clicking over the glass. She grabbed a first aid kit from the back, her face a mask of iron. "Move," she commanded. "Get out," Min-ho rasped, sliding down the workbench. "They'll be back." "Let them come. I'm tired of running, and I'm tired of your martyrdom." She sat on the floor beside him, ignoring the grease and the blood. She forced him to strip off his shirt, her touch clinical, cold, and utterly devoid of pity. She cleaned the wound with alcohol, the sting making him grunt, his fingers clawing at the concrete. "She's patching me up. The woman I was hired to kill is stitching my shoulder." "Why are you here?" he whispered, his eyes tracking the way her hair fell over her shoulder. She looked mature, dangerous, and for the first time, he saw a reflection of his own jagged, broken morality in the way she worked. "Because you owe me," she said, pulling the needle through his skin. "You took 15 years of my life. You don't get to die until you've paid for them." She tied the suture with a sharp, final jerk. She didn't let go of his shoulder. Her hand rested there, warm against his cooling skin. "I never wanted your forgiveness, Ji-won," he said, his voice dropping to a low, broken rasp. "I just wanted you to live, even if it was with a ghost." Ji-won looked at him, the man who had been a killer, the man who had been a savior, the man who was now just a ruin. She didn't offer a kiss. She didn't offer comfort. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, her breath ghosting over his skin. "We are both ghosts, Min-ho," she whispered. "The only difference is, I'm not done haunting you yet." She pulled away, the sterile silence of the shop returning like a shroud. She stood up, smoothing her dress, her posture as rigid as a blade. "Clean this up. We have a syndicate to dismantle." She walked to the shattered door and looked out into the rain. The street was empty, but the shadows were watching. "The debt isn't just about the money anymore," she said, not looking back. "It's about the blood." Min-ho stood up, his shoulders screaming, his blood soaking the bandage. He looked at the woman who had become his mirror. "The blood is already spilled, Ji-won." "Then we'll drown in it," she replied. The last thing she heard before leaving was the click of his pistol as he chambered around. Sharp, final, slap-like in its precision. The office of Chairman Rowe was an exercise in sterile intimidation. Polished mahogany, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the neon veins of Seoul, and the smell of expensive incense masking the scent of rotting ambition. Ji-won walked in first. She wore a tailored suit, the color of fresh bruises, her spine a steel rod. Behind her, Min-ho trailed like a shadow, a man who had traded his silence for a suicide mission. His arm was bound in a makeshift sling under his jacket, his movements heavy, methodical, and stripped of all hesitation. Ro sat behind his desk, a string of prayer beads clicking between his fingers. "You bring a dead man to my house, Mrs. Kang." Ro's voice was as smooth as oil. "I expected you to be wiser. The accounting doesn't balance." "The accounting is finished," Ji-won said. She placed a single digital drive on the desk. "I didn't come to negotiate the debt. I came to liquidate the assets." Min-ho moved to the side, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He didn't look at Ro. He looked at the guards, tracking their hands, their stance, the way they stood too close to their weapons. He knew exactly where the exits were and how many seconds it would take for him to bleed out before the final bullet landed. "The drive contains the offshore routing numbers for the Black Lotus operations," Ji-won continued. Her voice didn't waver. "It's already being uploaded to the district prosecutor's cloud. By the time you finish this sentence, your entire hierarchy is an open book." Ro stopped clicking his beads. The silence in the room was surgical. "You think they care about a widow's digital revenge?" Ro leaned forward. "I am the law in this district." "You were," Min-ho said, his voice a gravel scrape in the quiet. "Until you let the wrong people see the ledger." The lights flickered. On the walls, the flat-screen monitors, usually displaying stocks or surveillance, suddenly shifted to a cascade of financial crimes, timestamps, and names. It was a digital suicide note for the Black Lotus. Chaos didn't erupt with a shout. It arrived with the cold, precise sound of weapons being drawn. Min-ho lunged. He didn't aim for Ro. He aimed for the man closest to the door, the one with the silenced pistol. The struggle was frantic, a collision of bodies and desperation. Min-ho took a blow to the ribs that sounded like a cracked hull, but he didn't stop. He pivoted, using the weight of his own body to slam his opponent into the glass, the pain spiderwebbing under the impact. Ji-won didn't scream. She stepped back, her eyes fixed on the man who had ordered her husband's death, the man who sat behind the desk, watching the walls fall. "You didn't kill him for the money," she said, her voice cutting through the sounds of the fight. "You killed him because he was the only one who realized you were a fraud." Ro reached for a drawer, his face a mask of panicked composure. He pulled a handgun, but before his finger could curl around the trigger, a shot echoed from the door. Not from Min-ho. Dong-sik stood there, his own gun leveled at the chairman. "The interest is too high, Chairman," Dong-sik said, his face twisted in a jagged grin. "I'm taking the accounts." The room devolved into a blur of motion. Min-ho tackled one of the remaining guards, his movements jagged, exhausted, the blood from his shoulder staining his white shirt a dark, rusted red. He didn't finish the man. He just neutralized him, leaving him on the floor like a discarded part. When the dust settled, the silence was absolute. Ro was slumped over his desk, a hole in his chest. Dong-sik was gone, vanished into the chaos of the building's security override. Min-ho leaned against the glass, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. He looked at Ji-won. She stood in the center of the office, her hair disheveled, her face pale, but her hands were perfectly still. "It's over," he whispered. Ji-won walked toward him. She stopped just out of reach, the smell of gunpowder clinging to her skin. "The debt is erased," she said. "But the scars?" Min-ho looked down at his blood-soaked shirt, then back at her. The composed masculine mask had shattered, leaving behind a man who had finally looked into the mirror and realized he didn't exist. "Scars are just reminders," he said. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask for mercy. He just turned and walked toward the exit, his limp heavy, a ghost walking out of a house that had finally stopped burning. The salt air in the coastal town of Sokcho didn't smell like the city. It smelled of decay and tides, things that washed up and things that were eventually pulled back into the dark. Ji-won sat on a wooden bench overlooking the gray expanse of the East Sea. She wore a coat that had seen better winters, her hair loose, pulled back by the relentless wind. She looked different, less like a diamond, more like the raw granite of the cliffs behind her. She had sold the house in Gangnam, sold the memories that had been nothing but ledger entries in a dead man's book, and moved to the edge of the map. A car pulled up, tires crunching on the gravel. She didn't turn. She knew the rhythm of the engine, the slight, intentional hesitation in the ignition. Min-ho climbed out. He looked thinner, his face a landscape of hollows and hard lines. He didn't approach her with the practiced calm of the mechanic in Incheon. He walked with the heavy, uneven gait of a man who had kept his wounds because he didn't know how to exist without them. He stood behind the bench, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of a worn jacket. "You're hard to find," he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its sandpaper edge. "I didn't want to be found," Ji-won replied. She stared at the horizon, where the sea blurred into the sky. "You look tired, Min-ho." "I look like what I am." He took a step forward, then stopped, maintaining the distance. He had spent years closing gaps, invading spaces, and now, for the first time, he respected the void between them. "The Lotus is gone," he said. "The police reports were thorough." "A lot of things are gone." Ji-won finally turned her head. Her eyes were not the hard, jagged glass of the widow in the shop. They were tired, a bone-deep, quiet exhaustion that mirrored his own. She looked at the man who had been a killer, then a savior, then a fracture in her life. She looked at the man she had learned to survive, but never to truly know. "I went to the gravesite," she said. "My husband's. I left the ledger on the stone. Let the rain erase the numbers." Min-ho nodded. He looked out at the water, his profile sharp and lonely. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. The words weren't a plea. They were a simple, heavy statement of fact. "I did what I did, and I stayed to watch the fallout. That's not redemption. It's just inertia." Ji-won stood up, her movement slow. She walked to the railing, leaning her weight against the cold wood. She looked at him, the maturity in his face, the composed masculine grace that had been his only consistent feature. "I don't forgive you," she said, her voice soft, steady, and devoid of hate. "Forgiveness is for people who think they can go back and fix the error. I don't think you can. I don't think I can." She turned to face him fully, the wind whipping her hair across her face. I just don't hate you anymore, Minho. Hate requires an investment of time I don't have left. Minho held her gaze. For a second, the mask of the composed mechanic flickered. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 15 years and was finally, painfully, starting to exhale. That's enough, he said. It has to be. She looked at him one last time, the man she had sabotaged, the man who had protected her with blood, the man who would always be a reminder of the life she'd burned to the ground. She didn't reach out. She didn't offer a hand. She turned and began to walk toward the town, her footsteps deliberate on the uneven path. Where are you going? He called out. His voice was a low, jagged sound that didn't demand an answer, only an acknowledgement. Ji-won stopped. She didn't turn back. She just looked up at the sky, the clouds shifting over the water. Some debts you never pay off, Minho, she said, her voice firm, the final line a strike against the quiet. You just stop adding interest. She kept walking, disappearing into the mist of the coast, leaving him standing there, a man with grease on his hands and nothing left to fix. The wind howled, a lonely, hollow sound, and the sea continued its long, rhythmic crawl against the shore. Some things don't get redeemed. They just get finished.